Growing up, all I ever wanted was a best friend in my older sister Sasha. I modeled everything after her: my clothes, my hobbies, my interests. When she came home with a trophy or an award, I was the first person she told. And instead of feeling threatened, I genuinely celebrated her. I'd throw my arms around her neck and tell her how proud I was, meaning every word. She hated it. Where most siblings might have found comfort in a younger sister's admiration, Sasha found competition. The warmth I offered felt like a challenge to her, like I was closing a gap she needed to keep open. She wanted to be better than me, not close to me, and my refusal to react with jealousy seemed to infuriate her more than jealousy itself would have. The shoving started small, a hand on my shoulder that pushed a little too hard, a bump in the hallway that sent me into the wall, but it escalated. By the time I was 10, she would shove me hard enough that my whole body would go down, and then she'd step over me like I was furniture. I kept trying anyway. I was a stubborn kid who believed that love was enough to fix things if you just applied enough of it. My 12th birthday ended that belief permanently. Our parents had saved up for the pink glittery bike that Sasha had wanted for 2 years and never received. When they gave it to me instead, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt guilty. I ran upstairs immediately to bring her down and show her not to gloat, but because sharing things with her was my instinct, even when she had never once returned the gesture. She came outside and looked at the bike for a long moment. I asked if she wanted to be the first to ride it. She smiled and said yes. Then she picked it up, looked me directly in the eyes, and threw it into the road just as a truck was passing. The sound of the wheels getting crushed under that truck is something I can still hear on bad nights. My parents were horrified. Sasha walked back inside without a word, and something in me, some last stubborn thread of hope, snapped clean in two. I made a decision that day that I kept for years. I would not share anything with her. Not achievements, not plans, not feelings. Whatever was mine would stay mine, locked away somewhere she couldn't reach it. The loneliness that followed was real and heavy, but it felt safer than the alternative. I got good at keeping secrets. At school, I let myself be proud of things without bringing them home. When teachers praised my work, I smiled and tucked the feeling away for later, somewhere private. When I made friends, I kept them separate from my home life. I built two worlds and lived carefully between them. The awards ceremony incident when I was 14 confirmed I had made the right choice. I had won the regional cross-country championships, a genuine achievement I had worked toward for months of early mornings and aching muscles. Sasha hadn't moved out for college yet and overheard our parents talking about it. To my complete surprise, she asked to come to the ceremony and seemed sincere about it. I let myself hope. I told her yes and spent the drive there wondering if maybe things were finally shifting between us. The coach was announcing winners in ascending order. My name was coming. I could feel the moment building. Then Sasha collapsed. She went down dramatically onto the floor and didn't wake up until the ambulance sirens were already audible outside. Then she sat up, looked around at all the concerned faces, and announced she simply hadn't eaten enough that day. The room exhaled with relief. Everyone turned their attention to her recovery. My name was never called. The ceremony moved on. I drove home staring out the window and said nothing. After that, I kept my life locked down so completely that even our extended family knew almost nothing real about me. It was a lonely way to grow up. There were moments, getting a perfect score on an exam, finishing first in a race, getting a compliment from a teacher I respected, when the desire to run to my parents and share the news felt almost physical. I had to train myself out of it. I learned to be my own celebration. By 17, I had mastered the performance of a quieter, smaller version of myself at home while quietly building something significant everywhere else. Then came the Ivy League acceptance. My parents found the letter before I did. I came home to my mother crying happy tears and my father already planning which photo would go on the mantle. For the first time in years, I let them in. I hugged them and let myself feel it. The pride, the relief, the sense that all those years of working quietly and carefully had amounted to something real. I even let myself think that Sasha couldn't touch this one. It was already done. The acceptance was in writing. What could she possibly do? The answer came the next morning. My parents burst into my room before I was fully awake and began throwing my belongings into black bin bags. Their faces were devastated in a way that told me something had shifted dramatically overnight. My mother's voice was shaking when she explained that Sasha had just been diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. She would need my room for her things and a second room to sleep in. I was moving to the couch. I sat up in bed and felt something cold and clear settle over me. She was lying. I was certain of it immediately. Not from any single piece of evidence, but from 17 years of watching how Sasha operated. The timing was too perfect. The cancer appeared the morning after my acceptance was celebrated. The diagnosis was devastating enough to override everything else in the household. It had Sasha written all over it, but certainty without evidence was useless. My parents were already grief-stricken and would not hear accusations from me without proof. I needed to be patient and strategic. When Sasha arrived home later that day, her head was shaved, which should have been convincing. But I had seen a photograph on her social media just weeks earlier, her hair blowing in the wind on a beach somewhere, looking perfectly healthy and completely unaware of any coming illness. The timeline didn't work. I filed that observation away and said nothing. She lay down in my former room and told everyone the cancer was exhausting. I cooked her favorite meal that evening, made sure she felt comfortable and unthreatened, and started watching. I watched the way she moved when she thought no one was looking versus when she knew she had an audience. I noticed how her energy fluctuated conveniently with whoever was present. I noted the way she touched her scalp sometimes in a way that seemed slightly off, not like someone whose head was sore from hair loss, but like someone making sure something was properly attached. 2 weeks into sleeping, on the couch, Sasha announced she wanted to throw a party to celebrate her own bravery. She invited everyone we knew, including several girls from my class. I recognized it immediately as an opportunity. Halfway through the party, I tapped my glass with a fork and called for Sasha to make a speech. She launched into it immediately, too fluently, with the cadence of something rehearsed rather than heartfelt. I had heard her practicing it in the bathroom mirror for days. The fake tears arrived on cue. I walked up to her and hugged her. As I pulled away, I grabbed the edge of what I had been watching for and peeled it cleanly away from her scalp. The bald cap came off in my hand. Her full blonde hair unraveled down to her waist. The room went silent in a way that felt almost physical. Sasha screamed. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. While everyone processed what had had happened, I crossed the room and turned on the television, which I had already connected to my laptop. The video I had recorded of her rehearsing her speech in the bathroom mirror, complete with practiced tearful pauses and dramatic hand gestures, played at full volume. Then Sasha walked out. Not ran, walked, which told me she was already calculating her next move rather than genuinely falling apart. I went to my room and let my parents handle the guests. The slap came the next morning. My mother's hand across my face before I was fully awake, her voice raw with fury. She said I had humiliated Sasha in front of everyone while she was battling cancer. I touched my cheek and stared at her and waited. Sasha's explanation had apparently been elegant. She told my parents she had purchased extremely expensive, realistic hair extensions because she didn't want people pitying her for her baldness and didn't want to flaunt the wealth required to afford such things. She framed my actions as an act of jealous cruelty against a sick woman, and my parents believed her. I sat with that for a long time. Not the pain of the slap, but the deeper, older pain of watching the people who were supposed to know me best choose the more convenient story. The forged medical documents arrived over the following days. Appointment cards, test results, a treatment schedule printed on what appeared to be authentic hospital letterhead. I examined them closely and noticed things. Subtle font inconsistencies, medical terminology that was slightly off in the way of someone who had researched it online rather than copied from real documents, watermarks that matched across paperwork supposedly from different medical offices. But none of that was obvious enough for a grieving parent who wanted to believe their daughter. Then Sasha began telling people I was emotionally abusive, that I was jealous of the attention her illness was generating, that I was trying to make everything about my college acceptance. My parents enrolled me in therapy, twice weekly sessions with a therapist who had been briefed on my jealousy issues and need for attention before I ever walked through the door. Those sessions were some of the most frustrating experiences of my life. I would try to explain what was happening and watch the therapist write careful notes about my denial. Every attempt to present evidence made me look more unstable. The harder I pushed back, the more it seemed to confirm the narrative Sasha had constructed. I learned to be very careful about what I said and how I said it, which was its own kind of exhausting. Meanwhile, Sasha took over the house. Extended family visited regularly to support the brave cancer patient. She hosted small gatherings where she would make subtle comments about the difficulty of having an unsupportive sister. Nothing quotable, nothing direct, just a steady drip of poison designed to erode everyone's goodwill toward. She was extraordinarily skilled at it. Then my laptop was destroyed. I came home one evening to find it on the floor with a cracked screen and a bent keyboard, completely non-functional. Years of essays, projects, and college application materials were gone. I found Sasha in the kitchen making tea, and she smiled at me and commented on how unreliable technology could be. Then she asked if I had backed up my college application materials. The way she said it was a work of art, plausibly innocent if you wanted it to be, unmistakable if you knew her. I spent a week rebuilding everything from memory. I begged teachers for extensions and explained what had happened. Some believed me. Others thought I was making excuses. My grades began slipping from the cumulative weight of everything, and rumors started circulating at school that I had attacked my cancer-stricken sister at her own support party. My lunch table emptied one person at a time until I was eating alone. Then came the letter from my college. They had received an anonymous complaint about my behavior toward a family member with terminal illness and needed to investigate before finalizing my enrollment. I recognized Sasha's phrasing in the complaint immediately. She had been careful to stay anonymous, but had used specific constructions I had heard her use before. Recognition of a writing style isn't legal evidence, but it was enough for me to understand what I was dealing with. I made a plan. I bought several small voice recorders and hid them carefully around the house, behind picture frames, beneath table edges, in spaces that were out of sight but within range of the rooms Sasha used most. I began documenting everything with timestamps and cross-references. I built a folder of screenshots. Sasha at the mall on a Tuesday she claimed to have chemotherapy. Sasha laughing in photos posted on days she had told our parents she was too ill to leave bed. Sasha in conversations where her stories contradicted themselves in small but measurable ways. The recordings were more revealing than I had expected. Late at night, Sasha would call friends from her room and describe our parents' worried expressions with barely contained laughter. She bragged about getting my room. She mimicked our mother's concerned voice until her friends cackled on the other end. She talked about my college plans with a contempt that made my stomach hurt, even as it confirmed everything I already knew. I saved every file to multiple cloud accounts. I created backups and then backups of the backups. I labeled everything by date and time and organized it into folders that documented weeks of deception in careful, cross-referenced detail. Then I remembered Aunt Helen. Helen had always been different from the rest of the family. She noticed things. She had caught Sasha in small lies at gatherings for years, a spelling bee win at a school that didn't hold them, an award from a competition that hadn't taken place. She was the only adult in my life who had ever looked at Sasha with something other than complete faith. More importantly, she had spent years working at a law firm handling medical malpractice cases and knew what authentic medical documentation looked like. I called her from a payphone at school, tucked behind the gymnasium where no one would see me. The receiver was cold and the booth smelled like rust, but hearing Helen's voice made me feel less alone than I had in months. I told her everything in a rush, words falling over each other. She stayed quiet through most of it, breathing steadily, and then said she had suspected something was off for a while. Sasha's medical story had kept shifting. First lymphoma, then leukemia, then some rare form that seemed to change names with each retelling. She said she would come that weekend and pretend it was a support visit. Hung up and walked back class feeling something I had almost forgotten how to feel, genuinely hopeful. That Friday I came home to find every recorder gone from its hiding spot. The dust outlines showed where they had been. The backup drives I had hidden in an old shoe were missing. Sasha was on the couch reading a magazine without looking up, and when I asked about the recorders, she said she didn't know what I was talking about. I still had the cloud backups. That night I changed every password I owned, set up two-factor authentication on everything, and created dummy accounts with false evidence in case she managed to access those too. I built digital walls and hid the real thing behind them. Helen arrived Saturday morning with a casserole and her good pearls. She hugged Sasha and listened to the performance with every outward sign of sympathy, while I watched from the the kitchen and kept my face carefully neutral. Later, Helen asked to see my room to help me organize. And once the door was closed, she sat on the edge of my bed and went through everything I had saved on my phone. Her face darkened with each recording. She had to stop once to collect herself when she heard Sasha laughing about intercepting my college acceptance letter. She spent a long time examining the medical documents I had photographed, pointing out the matching watermarks across supposedly separate offices, the identical font sizes, the medical terminology that someone had clearly assembled from internet research rather than copied from actual records. She pointed out inconsistencies I had missed. Sasha claimed chemotherapy every Monday but was never visibly ill on Tuesdays. Nausea and fatigue from that kind of treatment don't disappear overnight. The patterns didn't match what she had seen in real cases. We agreed to present everything. At dinner, when the atmosphere was relaxed, at the table that evening, Sasha was performing beautifully, pushing food around her plate with theatrical exhaustion, sighing about her lost appetite, accepting our mother's immediate offer to cook something else with practiced reluctance. Helen started with gentle questions about the treatment plan, which hospital, which oncologist, whether the team was local. Sasha deflected smoothly, citing privacy and not wanting to burden everyone. Helen mentioned she had a friend who was an oncologist and offered to make a connection. She even lifted her phone as though ready to dial. Sasha's eye twitched. She covered it with a gesture toward her face and said her team had everything handled. When Helen asked for the oncologist's name to send a thank you card, Sasha stood up and accused herself to the bathroom. While she was gone, Helen turned to my parents and asked, quietly and directly, whether they had attended a single appointment with Sasha. My mother admitted they hadn't. Sasha had said she needed independence through the process. My mother looked embarrassed saying it, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap. My father said Sasha had told them she was protecting them from the harsh realities of treatment. His knuckles were white where his hands were folded on the table. Helen put her phone down and played the recording. My parents didn't want to look at first. They turned their heads the way children avoid something unpleasant. Helen was patient and methodical, moving through each piece of evidence in order, providing context for each one. My mother's face went pale the moment she heard Sasha's laughter. My father's expression moved through disbelief and horror and arrived at something cold and quiet. When Sasha came back from the bathroom and found us all watching her, she tried every available option in quick succession. She cried and said we were ganging up on her during her illness. She claimed I had faked the recordings using AI. She said I had somehow drugged her to make her say those things. Each new explanation was more desperate and less coherent than the last. My father stood up slowly. His chair creaked. He asked her plainly and directly, in the same voice he had used when I was a child, and he had caught me doing something wrong, whether she had cancer. She held the tears for another moment. Then she exploded. The rage that came out of her was years in the making. She screamed that we had always loved my achievements more than her, that I had stolen her parents' attention from the moment I learned to walk, that destroying my birthday bike had been the one time in her life she had felt genuinely powerful. It came out in a torrent. The laptop, the deleted essays, the anonymous college complaint, a dozen smaller acts of sabotage I hadn't even known about. Library books hidden so I would get fines. Lies told to kids at school. Photographs deleted from the family computer. Then she lunged. She came for me and my mother stepped between us. Sasha's nails caught my mother's arm on the way past and drew blood that dripped down onto the white tablecloth in small red blooms. That stopped everything. My mother stared at her arm. My father grabbed Sasha and pulled her back. She was still screaming as about how much she hated me, about how I had stolen her life by existing, about every achievement I had ever had being a personal attack on her. Helen called emergency services from the hallway, her voice calm and clear, her legal training holding her steady while the rest of us fell apart. The paramedics came for my mother's arm. They ended up taking Sasha too. She had worked herself into such a state that they were concerned about her safety. They walked her out past the neighbors whose porch lights had come on and whose curtains had quietly parted. The house was very quiet after that. My mother needed stitches and antibiotics. The doctor said the wounds were deep but would heal. On the drive home, my father didn't say anything. None of us did. That night, my parents sat me down and apologized. My mother touched my cheek gently where she had slapped me and cried while she said she was sorry. My father described how completely the cancer story had disarmed them, how the fear of losing a child had overridden every instinct to question anything. They had wanted to support her and had ended up funding a lie at the expense of the daughter who was telling the truth. I told them everything then, not to hurt them, but because they needed to understand that this wasn't new. I told them about the bike and the awards ceremony and the recording I deleted and the laptop and years of smaller cruelties. They listened without interrupting. My father kept shaking his head slowly. My mother cried steadily through most of it. We agreed that Sasha needed real professional help, not the therapy they had forced on me. Actual treatment for whatever was driving this. My father spent the next day on the phone researching facilities that specialized in personality disorders. My own work was more immediate. I sent the college the recording of Sasha's confession alongside a letter from Helen documenting what she had witnessed and her professional assessment of the forged medical paperwork. I included the therapy notes that showed I had been positioned as the unstable party without cause. I organized everything clearly and submitted it all at once. The admissions officer called personally to apologize for the confusion and to confirm my enrollment. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward and let myself cry for a few minutes. Then I dried my face and started making a list of everything else that needed fixing. School was harder. Rumors don't retract themselves, and the social damage of several months takes longer to undo than it takes to create. I focused on the friendships that were real and ignored everything else. My academic teachers had seen enough of my actual work that they extended grace when I needed it. My grades recovered slowly, one assignment and one test at a time, late nights at my desk with coffee going cold beside me. Sasha came home after 3 days of observation with a mandatory therapy schedule and a diagnosis the therapist would eventually share with us: narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features. She moved back into her room without apology, and we avoided each other with the wordless efficiency of two people who have agreed to a ceasefire without discussing terms. But she wasn't done entirely. I caught her in my room going through my college paperwork one afternoon. She said she was looking for a pen. My acceptance letter was crumpled in a way that suggested it had been squeezed. That night, I installed a dead deadbolt on my bedroom door. My parents helped me pick it out without asking me to justify the request. The click of that lock became the sound of safety. Prom season arrived, and I let myself feel cautiously excited. I had found a beautiful blue dress on sale, and my friend Aaron had asked me to go as his date. It felt like a small, normal piece of adolescence I had almost missed entirely. The night of prom, I was doing my makeup when I heard a crash. My dress was on the floor, covered in what was unmistakably bleach. The fabric was destroyed, huge white splotches across the blue material. The chemical smell still sharp in the air. Sasha's bathroom door clicked shut down the hall. I stood in my slip and stared at it for a moment. Then I called Aunt Helen. She arrived within the hour with her daughter's old prom dress, a deep green that fit me almost perfectly. She did my hair while I breathed through the frustration, and she told me I looked beautiful with the kind of certainty that made me believe it. She had matching jewelry in her purse, which told me she had suspected I might need rescuing and had come prepared. At prom, nobody cared about the change in dress. Aaron and I danced until our feet hurt. For a few hours, I was just a teenager at a dance, laughing at terrible music and taking photos with people I genuinely liked. When I came home, Sasha was waiting in the living room. She looked at the green dress and her face fell. She had been waiting to see me devastated. When I smiled and said I'd had an amazing night, she left the room without speaking. Her plan had failed completely. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. The therapist called a family meeting shortly after prom and recommended a residential treatment program for Sasha, somewhere she could focus on genuine healing without the triggers of daily home life. My parents were torn. They wanted to help her, but felt guilty about the idea of sending her away. The facility the therapist recommended was 3 hours from our house, surrounded by mountains and gardens. The staff were firm and kind in equal measure. The program lasted a minimum of 6 months with monthly family therapy sessions. We drove Sasha there on a Monday morning. She hugged our parents goodbye. She ignored me. I was at peace with that. The house was genuinely peaceful without her for the first time in my life. My parents and I had quiet dinners where we talked about real things. My mother asked about my day and listened to the answers. My father started small projects around the house that he had been putting off for years. We played board games some evenings and rediscovered how to be a family of 3 without the constant tension of managing Sasha's instability. I joined the yearbook committee. I started tutoring younger students in math. My college acceptance was confirmed, and I spent senior year actually enjoying high school for the first time, joining things, showing up to events, letting myself take up space without fear. The monthly family therapy sessions at the facility were difficult at first. Sasha would read acknowledgments of her behavior in a monotone that made it clear she was complying with a requirement rather than engaging with genuine remorse. The therapist said this was common early in treatment and that the compliance itself was a starting point. We went every month, and sometimes she participated and sometimes she simply sat and glared at the floor. But we went. My parents had to do their own work in those sessions, acknowledging that they had enabled behavior for years by refusing to see it clearly, that their fear of conflict had created space for Sasha's cruelty to grow unchallenged. Watching them take that accountability was painful and necessary. I started seeing my own therapist to process my side of things. Her office was quiet, and the work we did there was slow and sometimes brutal. Going back through years of experiences and examining what they had cost me, learning to separate what was my responsibility from what was not, understanding that wanting a sister was not what had created this situation. That last one took months to actually believe. Senior year passed in a series of milestones I got to actually experience. National Honor Society, a scholarship for an essay about overcoming family challenges, graduation day with my parents in the 3rd row and Helen beside them with her camera. When they called my name for the scholarship, my father whooped so loudly the whole auditorium turned around. I didn't feel embarrassed at all. I felt completely straightforwardly proud. During our graduation lunch, my mother's phone rang. It was the treatment facility. Sasha wanted to speak to me. I took the phone outside to where it was quieter. Her voice was different, flatter in some ways, but also less sharp. She congratulated me on graduating and asked about my college plans and listened to the answer without redirecting. When I mentioned the scholarship, she said, "Good job," without sarcasm. The conversation lasted 5 minutes and felt like something shifting very slightly in a direction I hadn't expected. The summer before college was full of preparation and something that felt cautiously like peace. My parents and I shopped for dorm supplies, and my father taught me to change oil and check tire pressure. Helen threw me a going-away party with all my favorite food. Before I left, there was a special family session at the facility. Sasha had something to share. She looked healthier. She had gained weight, and her complexion had color again. She held a piece of paper with both hands and read from it, her hands shaking slightly. The apology was real. She named specific incidents: the bike, the awards ceremony, the laptop, the forged document, the prom dress, the anonymous complaint to my college. She described each one without minimizing it or shifting blame. She said she had been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder and borderline traits, and that the diagnosis was not an excuse but an explanation that had helped her understand what she had been doing and why. She said she was learning to manage her emotional responses without destroying the people around her, that it was the hardest work she had ever done, that she was not asking for forgiveness because she understood she hadn't earned it. Sat with that for a moment. Then I thanked her for the apology and said I hoped treatment kept helping. The therapist said that was perfectly appropriate. Forgiveness couldn't be forced or rushed, and everyone had their own timeline. We had lunch at a nearby cafe afterward. Sasha with a staff member nearby. Conversation kept to safe topics. She asked about my roommate assignment, and I showed her the email. She said the girl seemed nice based on her profile. It was the most normal exchange we had ever had. 2 weeks before I left for college, I found a small wrapped box in my desk drawer. Inside was a necklace with my birthstone, ordered from the treatment facility's craft program. A note in Sasha's handwriting said simply, "For your new beginning." I didn't put it on, but I wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and packed it. Maybe someday, maybe not. But the gesture meant something I wasn't yet ready to name. Move-in day was joyful chaos. My parents carried too much, reorganized my room twice, and embarrassed me thoroughly in front of my new roommate, Kimberly. By evening, the room looked like a home goods store had experienced a natural disaster, but it felt right. Saying goodbye was harder than I had anticipated. My mother cried in the parking lot. My father checked the car tires 3 times. College was everything I had worked toward and more. Difficult classes that were genuinely interesting. Late-night study sessions connections with people who would become real friends. I joined the running club and the honors program and discovered that I could be good at things without having to protect those things from anyone. Thanksgiving break brought the first real test. Sasha was allowed a supervised home visit. She walked through the door looking nervous, sat at the table like a stranger, and gradually, over the course of a meal, became something closer to present. She asked about my classes. She helped clear plates without being prompted. After dinner, she asked if she could say something. She thanked us for not giving up on her, said she knew what she had put us through and that she was committed to being better, even when it was hard. My father reached over and squeezed her hand. She went back to treatment that night. I didn't hug her goodbye, but I waved from the port. The therapist had said healing wasn't linear. There would be good days and bad ones. At least we were moving. Winter break brought her to a transitional housing program, a studio apartment near a bookstore where she had found part-time work. She had enrolled in community college online courses. The structure seemed to suit her. She had always done better with clear expectations and consistent accountability than with open-ended freedom. Sophomore year arrived and I declared my major officially and joined a research team. My parents visited for Parents' Weekend and met my friends. They looked genuinely happy, not performing happiness but actually experiencing it, which I had almost forgotten was possible. Spring semester brought Dean's List and an invitation to the honors program. My parents framed the letter. Helen sent flowers. Sasha texted to say she was proud. I believed her. Junior year brought graduate school applications and a relationship with Sasha that had found something like a steady rhythm. We texted regularly about normal things, books she was reading, courses I was struggling with, restaurants she had tried. When I was working through organic chemistry, she offered to help, having taken it at community college. We spent an hour on video call going over my notes, and she was patient and clear and didn't make it about anything other than the work. My grade went from a C to a B+. I told my parents about the tutoring, and they exchanged the particular look of two people who had been cautiously hoping for exactly this. Senior year and graduate school. Applications and then the acceptance letters. Sasha responded to each one with genuine enthusiasm. No manufactured illness. No anonymous complaints. Just actual excitement about my future. She came to my graduation and sat with my parents and cheered when my name was called. She took photos when asked. She gave me a card with a message that I read twice to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Pride without calculation. Warm without agenda. The summer before graduate school, we spent more time together than we had in years. She helped me apartment hunt. She drove me to IKEA and assembled furniture without complaint. We laughed at real things at actual moments, and it sounded nothing like the forced performances of the household I had grown up in. The night before I moved, she asked me quietly whether we could be real sisters someday. Not now, she said, but eventually, when enough time had passed and enough trust had been built. I told her maybe, that I wanted to believe it was possible. She said that was more than she deserved. We loaded the moving truck together the next morning. My parents were emotional and trying to hide it. Sasha was practical and helpful. When everything was packed, she pressed a small gift into my hands, a framed photograph of us as little girls, both grinning at the camera, sisters who didn't yet know what was coming. I hung it in my new apartment facing my desk, not prominently but visible. A reminder that people can change when they do the work, that families can heal even after damage that feels permanent. That forgiveness arrives on its own timeline and cannot be forced, but sometimes, quietly, it comes. Sasha and I text regularly now. She tells me about her job and her classes and a therapy group she has started attending voluntarily, not because anyone required it. I tell her about my research and my friendships and the city I am learning to navigate. We are building something new on ground that was scorched for a long time. It is fragile and imperfect and nothing like what it could have been if things had gone differently. But it is ours, built from honest materials, and we are both tending it carefully. Looking back across all of it, from the pink bike destroyed in the road to the photograph on my apartment wall, I can see the shape of something I didn't understand while I was living through it. Not just survival, though there was a great deal of that, but also the slow accumulation of the things that actually last. Evidence gathered with patience, allies found with careful honesty, boundaries held without apology, and, eventually, improbably, the possibility of something worth keeping. We are not the family we could have been. There is too much history for that, but we are the family we chose to become. And some days that is more than enough.